Okay, so we got day 2 of this preliminary hearing in the David case. Remember, he's facing first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, unlawful mutilation of human remains charges, all in connection with the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, whose decomposed, dismembered body was allegedly found in the front trunk of a Tesla, allegedly registered to him. This was back in September of 2025. This is a hearing where...
First, the discovery. 11 air fresheners found inside a Tesla, found in the trunk where a body decomposed for months. Second, what they reveal about concealment. Somebody didn't just commit a crime here, they went to elaborate, methodical lengths to hide what they'd done. Third, the defense strategy forming in real time. Those same air fresheners that seem like obvious evidence of guilt, they're now being questioned, prodded, examined for what they actually prove. And fourth, the complication nobody expected. Body language in court, witness contradictions, and a timeline that raises harder questions than answers. This is what happened on day 2 of the preliminary hearing, and here's what actually separates the documented record from what myths tell us about this case. The Tesla was found in September of 2025. Inside the front trunk, authorities discovered the decomposed, dismembered remains of a 14-year-old girl. Her name was Celeste Rivas Hernandez. She had been missing since April of that same year. When investigators opened that trunk, they found cadaver bags. They found human remains. And they found something else that seemed almost routine compared to the horror around it. They found air fresheners. Not 1, not 2, 11 of them. Some inside the vehicle, some specifically in the trunk itself, placed deliberately among the remains. That detail matters because air fresheners suggest intention. Air fresheners suggest someone understood what was decomposing, understood the smell it would create, and took action to mask it. When Deputy DeBeth Silverman presented these findings to the court on day 2 of the preliminary hearing, she showed photographs. The reporter sitting behind the defendant described watching the girl's parents respond to those images.
It's really tough.
They moved closer together,
Jesse, I told
they
you
shrank into
yesterday,
themselves.
I cannot begin to imagine what they are going through. Yesterday, I was sitting directly behind them, 3 rows behind. Today, I'm sitting at an angle in the row right behind where they're seated. So I can see both of their facial expressions. The mother...
11 air fresheners is not a coincidental detail. It is not accidental. It is evidence of a specific kind of planning, a specific kind of awareness. Someone knew remains were in that trunk.
It's that somebody went to truly horrifying lengths, Jesse, to try and cover up their tracks.
Someone cared enough about being discovered to purchase and place 11 separate air fresheners to cover the smell of decomposition. But here's where the case becomes more complicated than the initial narrative suggests. The prosecution wants to establish that these air fresheners prove premeditation, prove calculation, prove that whoever placed them understood exactly what they were covering up. That's a reasonable read of the evidence. But on day 2 of the preliminary hearing, the defense team began constructing a different argument. And it's worth sitting with that argument because it reveals how preliminary hearings actually work. They're not about proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They're a much lower standard. They're about whether probable cause exists. And in a case built on circumstantial evidence, probable cause can mean many different things depending on how you frame the questions. The financial witness, Benjamin Greger, testified about money flowing through the defendant's career. $11.5 million.
Yes, he does come across as a little bit combative when he's talking to prosecutors, when he's talking to the deputy DA here, Beth Silverman. When she was cross-examining him, there were several instances where he gave her answers that not just misaligned, but were in direct opposition to what he apparently said during grand jury hearings. And she was actually referencing transcripts from those secret grand jury hearings to verify that, to be like, wait a minute, did you mean this house or the other house was going to be put up as collateral so David could make bail? And then she asked him very pointedly several times.
That's the number prosecutors keep emphasizing. The idea is that if the victim, Celeste, had exposed an alleged illegal relationship, all of that money would have disappeared. The defendant's entire career, his income, his future earnings. All of it would have been gone. That creates a financial motive for murder. It's a specific, quantifiable motive. Prosecutors are building toward the argument that air fresheners, cadaver bags, purchasing supplies under fake names, disposing of remains, all of it points to someone protecting something valuable. That's the narrative being constructed. But the defense is attacking this from multiple angles, and the air fresheners are part of that attack. When the lapped criminologist testified about the air fresheners, the cross-examination raised questions about what these objects actually prove. The defense didn't argue they weren't there.
Because when he was being cross-examined by defense attorneys, I didn't note the same kind of misalignment. There were more instances of Benjamin Greger, who was one of the financial managers for David when he first came to LA as a musical artist. There were more instances of Greger telling defense attorneys, yes, that's correct, that's the case, correct, I agree. I did not hear that when he was answering questions from the prosecutor.
So just to be clear,
They didn't argue they weren't placed deliberately. Instead, they asked whether this specific evidence definitively connects to the person being charged. They asked about chain of custody. They asked about documentation. They asked whether investigators followed proper procedure in cataloging these items. This is a common defense strategy in cases built on circumstantial evidence. You don't deny the evidence exists. You question whether it was properly handled, whether it was properly tested, whether the chain of custody was maintained. If you can create reasonable doubt about how evidence was preserved, you've created reasonable doubt about what the evidence proves. What's striking about this approach is what it suggests about the actual evidence in the case. If the evidence were overwhelming, if there were a confession, if there were direct eyewitness testimony, the defense wouldn't need to attack chain of custody. They'd need to do something much harder. They'd need to create an alternative narrative. Instead, the defense is working with a forensic case that relies heavily on objects, on purchase history, on timelines, and objects can be questioned. Chain of custody can be questioned. Timelines can be complicated.
Items that were purchased under a fake name but then sent to David's house. None of those purchases happened before April 23rd. Now, defense attorneys are not spelling out for us what they're trying to say by making that point, but they've definitely made that point. So we'll see where they go with that and everything else they've called out pretty methodically about the investigation, right? And the chain of custody with several pieces of critical evidence. Was that left alone? Did you have a log of everybody who was at the crime scene? Did you guys do traffic control for the entire time before CHP was called in after the Caltrans were?
The reporter in the courtroom made an observation that hasn't been emphasized enough in coverage of this case. The defendant's engagement during the financial testimony was intense.
I loved watching it. So yes, I was sitting right behind David this morning. I somehow got a seat in front of where they were seating other reporters. I think it's because I actually walked in a little bit later than everybody else did. So because of that, they had me seated on the end of one of the attorneys' rows in that courtroom, and I was right behind David. He didn't look too great. His hair is grown out. He is unshaven. He's wearing that LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit, and he still has his feet and his waist shackled. He's not wearing...
During cross-examination of financial witnesses, the defendant was staring at documents. He was leaning toward his attorneys. He was engaged, present, focused. The defense narrative being constructed is that he's a young artist, busy with his career, not involved in day-to-day financial management. His mother handled bills, set up companies, managed his money. He was alone for the first time, recording, in meetings, working with producers. But his body language during financial testimony doesn't match that narrative.
Today, there was another witness who was called to the stand after Benjamin Greger this morning from Interscope. And it was a similar line of questioning about accounts payable, how much money was made, money in, money out. And the way David was staring intently at the financial documents that were presented as exhibits, the way he was huddling with his own attorneys, And the way he seemed engaged during this cross-examination, that I'll be honest, was tedious. It was a little bit dry. I did not see many reporters around me, feverishly taking notes. But David's level of engagement during all of this makes me wonder if he actually had more of a hand in managing, or at the very least,
He seemed to understand the documents. He seemed to care about them. He seemed to be following the testimony closely. This is the kind of observation that's difficult to quantify in a preliminary hearing, but it matters for how a jury eventually perceives credibility. Here's an underexplored angle in this case that deserves more attention: the relationship between what the defense is claiming about the defendant's financial distance from his career and what his actual engagement in court suggests. If the defense is going to argue he didn't know how much he had to lose financially, they need to establish some version of him as disconnected, uninformed, not actively involved in his business. But a defendant who's staring intently at financial documents in court, who's leaning toward his attorneys, who's taking this testimony seriously, is a defendant who seems to understand money and its implications. That's a complication for the defense theory. It's not proof of guilt. It's just an inconsistency that has to be resolved somehow. The air fresheners themselves exist in this same space of ambiguity. They suggest planning. They suggest concealment. They suggest someone understood what needed to be hidden. But the defense can still argue they don't prove who placed them. They don't prove when they were placed. They don't prove the defendant placed them. 11 air fresheners are powerful evidence to a jury, but in a preliminary hearing where the standard is only probable cause, they're one piece of a larger mosaic of circumstantial detail. The timeline matters here in a way that hasn't been fully explored.
In court during the preliminary hearing, but I know you read this in the initial documents. That same day of the Santa Barbara road trip, April 24th, David went back home and then taped an interview promoting his album that came out.
The alleged murder occurred on April 23rd. The defendant allegedly drove to Santa Barbara the next day. He allegedly drove up there to dispose of evidence. But the body wasn't found until September. The passport card wasn't found until January of the following year. Investigators discovered 11 air fresheners in that trunk in September. But who can say when they were placed? Days after the murder? Weeks? Months? If someone was trying to conceal the smell of decomposition, they would have placed them relatively soon after placing remains in the trunk. But without testimony establishing when these air fresheners were purchased, without receipts, without documentation of exactly when they entered the vehicle, the timeline becomes murky. The prosecution wants this evidence to tell a story of immediate, deliberate concealment. Someone killed, someone put the body in the trunk, someone immediately purchased air fresheners to mask the smell. That's a narrative of panic and planning combined. It's frightening. It's damning. But narratives are different from documented facts. And in a case built on narratives about purchasing history, about financial motive, about air fresheners and cadaver bags, the defense's strategy is to make each piece of evidence slightly less certain. To question not whether it exists, but what it proves.
Just off the roadway, it was reportedly found, and then we heard some back and forth where defense attorneys cross-examined him and asked, was there any traffic control? Do you know if it was found face up or face down? Was it buried under anything? Did it just rain a day or two ago? So there are questions about how exactly it ended up there. But it was very interesting to hear from a witness who was actually called to that scene after I drove up there myself, because I was curious about where, off the roadway, how close to the lake this could have happened.
And the defense is questioning exactly how that passport card would have gotten there, that there were maybe other means other than David allegedly tossing it?
Absolutely. It sounds like they're setting up an argument where they could...
Here's a genuine open question from the documented record that the preliminary hearing hasn't fully resolved. If the defendant was trying to conceal the smell of a decomposing body in his own vehicle, why keep the body in his own vehicle? Why not remove it earlier? Why store remains in a trunk registered to him in a car people would have seen him driving? The prosecution's answer is probably that he didn't have another option, that disposal was harder than he anticipated, that planning a murder is different from executing one. The defense's answer might be different entirely. Maybe the remains weren't in that car when the defendant was driving it. Maybe someone else had access to the vehicle. Maybe the timeline is being misrepresented. These are the kinds of questions that might matter to a jury, even if they don't matter much to a preliminary hearing judge trying to decide whether probable cause exists. What we actually know is this: 11 air fresheners were found in a Tesla.
LAPD criminologist. This was one of the officers called to investigate after the Tesla was towed to one of their tech centers. So we were looking at photos the prosecutor was showing the court of 11 different air fresheners that were found in that Tesla. I mean, Celeste's remains had been in there decomposing, likely for months. So to cover up that smell, somebody put nearly a dozen air fresheners, not just inside the car, but actually in the front trunk.
Yeah.
And that's where the cadaver bags with her remains.
That vehicle was registered to the defendant. A 14-year-old girl's remains were found in the trunk. Those are documented facts. What we don't know is exactly when those air fresheners were placed.
Before we get into the substance, I also understand that Celeste's family was back in that courtroom. We talked about yesterday how incredibly difficult it was.
We don't know if the defendant personally purchased them, though prosecutors are building a case that he bought similar items under false names. We don't know the complete chain of custody for this evidence. We don't know whether a jury would find this evidence sufficient to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. At the preliminary hearing stage, none of that matters much. The judge only needs to find probable cause, and 11 air fresheners in a trunk with human remains probably crosses that threshold. But the preliminary hearing is also where defense strategies emerge. And the defense strategy here seems to be building around police procedure, evidence handling, and the relationship between what was found and what can actually be proven. They're not arguing the air fresheners don't exist. They're arguing that their existence doesn't definitively prove their client's guilt. That's a different argument. It's a more sophisticated argument. It's the kind of argument that might resonate with a jury, even if it doesn't impress a preliminary hearing judge. The case will move forward to trial. The judge will almost certainly find probable cause. But that preliminary hearing, that specific moment when photographs of 11 air fresheners were shown to a courtroom, when that girl's parents shrank into themselves, when a financial witness gave conflicting testimony, when a California Highway Patrol officer testified about a passport card found, 9 months after her death, that's when the actual legal contest began.
So this was interesting for me personally, Jesse. It was a CHP officer, California Highway Patrol. He's assigned to the Santa Barbara area. As soon as he walked in and they said that, I thought, oh, here we go. This is going to be the piece of testimony during prelim related to Lake Cachuma up in Santa Barbara County. So I love that area. I love Santa Barbara. I actually took a road trip up there a couple of weeks ago, back in June, because I wanted to check out State Road 154 myself. You know, we all read in court documents that a Caltrans worker back in January apparently found Celeste's ID up there. And prosecutors have been alleging that David took a trip up there the day after Celeste was allegedly stabbed and left to bleed to death. He allegedly drove up there in his own car to dispose of the evidence.
Not the outcome, the contest. The preliminary hearing is where both sides start laying out not their final arguments, but their first moves. And the air fresheners are going to matter in that trial, not because they definitively prove guilt, but because they tell a story. The prosecution's story is one of premeditation and concealment. The defense's story will be about reasonable doubt and the limits of circumstantial evidence. The case continues. More hearings are expected, potentially up to 5 days of preliminary testimony. What's worth considering, as this case develops, is how individual pieces of evidence, however damning they seem, don't actually answer all the questions we want answered. 11 air fresheners create an inference. They don't create certainty. They create a narrative. They don't create truth. And the space between inference and proof, between narrative and truth, that's where the actual case lives. Follow the next developments in this preliminary hearing as the trial strategy becomes clearer. Comment below with your read on what the air fresheners actually prove and what remains genuinely ambiguous about this case.